So what is neuroscience? What is its history? And what are the major branches of this field? Neuroscience is a branch of biological sciences that is mainly interested in studying the nervous system, whether if it's its structures, functions, or disorders. Now, the history of neuroscience is a little bit more complicated because it dates back to 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. For example, in France, they found a prehistoric skull that went through a procedure referred to as trepanation. The procedure itself involves drilling a hole or two on the skull to release some intracranial pressure or to cure some sort of neurological disorder, such as epilepsy. Moving forward to the ancient times, for example, in ancient Egypt, there is the infamous Edwin Smith papyrus, or a surgical papyrus, which was written around the 17th, 18th century BC. Now, this ancient Egyptian medical text was describing the diagnosis and symptoms of a couple of patients by an Egyptian physician. Of course, it was written back then in hieroglyph, which was the ancient Egyptian writing system. Now, the patients themselves were described as having seizures and aphasia, basically not being able to speak following head injuries. In ancient Greece, on the other hand, there was more of a philosophical debate whether the brain or the heart is the seat of intellect, where we have, for example, Aristotle, who believed that the heart is actually the seat of intelligence and not the brain. On the other hand, we had philosophers and physicians like Herophilus and Hippocrates that believed that the brain actually is the seat of intelligence and not the heart. During the Roman Empire, we had Galen, who was a Greek-Roman physician that proposed that the cerebellum was responsible for processing senses, where the cerebrum was responsible for controlling muscles. Galen also proposed that the brain functions through the movement of the spirit or the soul through the ventricles of the brain. Now, moving forward to medieval times, when we had physicians and philosophers like Az-Zahrawi and Avicenna or Ibn Sina. Both of these physicians and philosophers, they had extensive work in medicine regarding treatments, surgeries, and description of symptoms and different diseases and disorders, including neurology. In Europe, on the other hand, it wasn't until the 14th century when the first textbook on anatomy was written, including a description of the brain by Mondino de Lozzi and Guido da Vigevano. Now, during the Renaissance, this is when the scientific revolution took place, and this is when a lot of research regarding science, specifically neuroscience, have skyrocketed significantly. For example, we had René Descartes, who was the father of dualism, who was interested mainly in studying the brain and the mind, and it's the relationship between these two. Now, one of the theories that he proposed was that the pineal gland in the brain is where the mind and the body interact. Around the same period, we had someone like Thomas Willis, who discovered the circle of Willis, which is basically a group of arteries in the base of the brain. We shouldn't also forget about Leonardo da Vinci, who had also interest in science and neuroscience, and he had his infamous drawings of the human brain and the ventricular system. In more of modern times, let's say the 18th century, 19th century onwards, this is when neuroscientific research started becoming more and more significant. We had notable people within the field of neuroscience, such as Charles Bill, who discovered Bill's palsy, and of course Jean-Pierre Flourens, who was mainly focused on localization and the different areas of the brain. So he was studying this by creating some lesions on different parts of the brain and then seeing the actual effects, whether behavioral or physiological, of these lesions. Around the same period, we had Franz Gall, who was a German physiologist. He was also the father of phrenology, which was a pseudoscience and a controversial field. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, we had significant figures in neurology and neuroscience, such as Ramon Cajal and Camillo Golgi. Now, both of these figures, they won Nobel Prize, or they shared a Nobel Prize in 1906 for discovering individual neurons. Of course, these two had disagreements at first about whether these neurons are individual or they're connected to each other. Cajal was more leaning towards that neurons are actually singular and individual and they do not interact with each other directly, where Golgi was the one who suggested that these neurons are connected and making networks within the brain and the spinal cord. Of course, we cannot talk about the history of neuroscience without mentioning the curious case of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was an American railroad construction worker who had a work accident where a metal rod, and more specifically iron rod, entered the front part of his brain, destroying the frontal lobe. Now, this caused a dramatic change in his personality and behavior, where he became more disrespectful and rude to his colleagues, to the point that his physician that attended his case, John Harlow, described him as no longer Gage. Of course, this is a significant case in the history of neuroscience because it eventually led to the creation of a procedure called lobotomy. Now, lobotomy was originated by the Portuguese neurologist Antonio Muniz, who won a Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1949. Now, the procedure itself was popularized in the state by Walter Freeman, who was a physician specialized in lobotomy. Freeman was going around the states lobotomizing people without even anesthetics in most cases. Now, lobotomy was originally created as a possible treatment for depression, manic disorders, and epilepsy. Now, one of the notable cases of lobotomy was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of JFK. She underwent the frontal lobe lobotomy, but unfortunately it did not work out for her, and she ended up incapacitated for the rest of her life. Now, there are around 30 different branches of neuroscience. Whether studying the cells themselves or the neurons, their shapes and positions within the brain, also referred to as cellular neuroscience, or even studying the proteins within these cells and the genetics within these cells, also known as molecular neuroscience or neurogenetics in the case of studying the genes, all the way to studying the connections between different parts of the brain and the different networks, known as systems neuroscience. So other branches of neuroscience include neurochemistry, where you study chemistry from the name. You have neuroimmunology, where you study the connection between the brain or the nervous system and the immune system. You have neuroimaging, where you study and apply various imaging techniques to the brain and the nervous system. So there are different branches of neuroscience, and these branches are expanding as we speak. And as technology, especially AI, is developing and improving every single day, there will be even more branches of neuroscience where you can study the brain from a completely different perspective.